of the day where you are. Today, we're going to kick off our 2023 webinar lineup with a great one that has been requested by the members, and the members spoke and we listened. I will go ahead and get us all started with a very quick introduction of the ICCP. The Institute of Construction Claims Practitioners is a professional members organization. We exist to recognize the skills, qualifications, and knowledge it takes to professionally manage claims to the highest possible standard. And our main objectives are to establish international professional standards for the management of claims, to give recognition to those who've gained that knowledge, and to help and educate those who wish to gain that knowledge. And so why is there the need for the ICCP when there are so many other construction organizations? Well, quite simply, claims have become a key part of the international construction industry, and claims practitioners come from a broad variety of construction backgrounds, from quantity surveying, project management, engineering, legal, etc. And until the ICCP, there has not been an organization specifically recognizing the specialist knowledge, experience, and skills that it takes to manage, prepare, and respond to claims to the highest degree of professionalism. Okay, so I will quickly introduce that we have an elected steering committee. Today's webinar is being presented by our current president, Paul Gibbons, and Christiaan Grosskopf, which I'm sure I did not pronounce correctly. I'm very sorry. And we have also two other elected members of our steering committee. In fact, a quick reminder to any members who are watching today, if you have not voted, you have only a few short weeks left to get your vote in. Please do so. And in terms of membership, I won't go into detail, but we do have 3 regular levels of individual membership that each have their own criteria. We also have student and graduate memberships for students and those who have just completed their initial degree. We also have corporate membership for companies and companies with departments that specialize in construction claims. So what is in it for the members? Why should you join? Well, we have a members area of our website, which has our knowledge bank of research, articles, white papers, case studies, etc., collected in one place for you to find out what's going on in claims around the world. We have a growing library of practical templates to save you time and also make sure that your claims are handled to the best degree possible. We have regular CPD webinars, such as this one. So most of our webinars are open to the public, but only members receive the CPD certificates. That is a benefit of membership. We also have the ICCP Academy, which are more technical webinars, which are only available for members. We offer savings on publications through Wiley Blackwell and Rutledge, as well as our training partner Claims Class. We have a monthly newsletter to keep members up to date. We offer industry exposure in the form of a public listing of members, as well as a membership certificate and logos for personal use. We also have a private LinkedIn group where members can confidentially discuss their construction claims and contracts questions. And finally, we have the optional benefit of the Register of Claims Practitioners for our members who would like to increase their online profile, in particular, usually consultants, etc. All right, I realized that was a whirlwind tour. So if you would like to know more, please visit our website, instituteccp.com, or email me, jennifer.smith@instituteccp.com. And if you registered for this webinar and requested additional information, I will be emailing you in the next few days with that information. And with that, I will hand this over to Paul. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Jen. And let me just start my slideshow. Okie dokie. Right, sorry about that. Well, as Jen said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. My name is Paul Gibbons. I'm the current president of the ICCP, founding director of Decipher Consulting here in the UK. Christian and I have been asked to give a presentation on price escalation and inflation. We had or have 350 people sign up to this event today, so it's obviously a huge matter in the construction sector, and I'm pleased to see so many of you join us here today for this session. So I'm going to lead off with my thoughts on price escalation, what you might want to be thinking about, how you might want to be dealing with it, and then Christian is going to be coming in and talking us through some formulaic methods of how you might want to deal with price escalation. And then there'll be some questions at the end. I think it's fair to say, and we're all quite aware that the impact of COVID and the Ukraine/Russia war has caused significantly long leading times for materials. Contractors who were previously skilled and experienced in quoting fixed fees or guaranteed maximum prices, GMPs, are finding it harder and indeed possibly aren't quoting on this basis anymore. And the reason being is because there's too much risk involved with including those fixed fees and guaranteed maximum prices. And contractors have sought to put in price escalation clauses in their terms and conditions. And as I say, it was pleasing to see there that the contracts question, that a lot of you have got price escalation clauses written in to the terms and conditions. I don't know if they are standard or whether they have been amended, but it is pleasing to know that you have got a price escalation clause, and indeed that the employers are acknowledging that price escalation and inflation is a joint problem that needs to be resolved to allow these projects to get built. So a lack of materials worldwide, that has caused price escalation, and we've seen it in regards to steel, copper, engineered wood products and plastic-based materials. So that will continue, and we're seeing it on the projects that we're involved with. But what is the difference between inflation and price escalation? Well, inflation can be classed as an increased price of a basket of goods or services, and escalation is predominantly an increased price of specified goods or services. And inflation is one of the factors that actually causes escalation itself. So just going back to April 21, and I know that this is nearly a couple of years ago, but the supply chain suffered disruptions, and this led to increased costs. And these increased costs have remained in place since 2021. This is what we're seeing in the projects that we're involved with. Between April 2020 and April 21, input costs for materials, labour, plant, these increased by an excess of 26%. And in the same period, bid prices, which is what the contractors charge, only increased by 5.2%. So you can see there's a huge big disconnect between what the contractors were incurring in costs and what their bid prices, what they're actually being able to charge out on these various projects that they're working on. And again, this particular point now is in relation to the UK market, but in 2012, UK inflation stood at 3.5%. And in 2022, just at the back end of last year, it was standing at 10.7%. So you can see there's this huge, big disparity in that decade period. But as I say, the whole point with this price escalation is to get the employer and the contractors to work harmoniously to deal with it. So what is a price escalation clause? Well, it allows a contractor to impose a price increase for materials or labour after the contract has been signed. And this inevitably shifts the risk from the contractor to the employer. Price escalation clauses are predominantly used on long duration and complex projects, because it's these projects that are going to be suffering the most. I was working on a project and advising on one last year, where they had a price escalation clause, and the project itself was a 4-year duration. So you can imagine there that not having that price escalation clause on an international project was going to cause significant issues. But as I say, on that particular project, they had a price escalation clause and they were applying it. Price escalation is when an item has a different price in a different market or location, and these are driven by supply chain factors such as shipping costs, fuel, and tariffs. So how should you negotiate such clauses? Well, there will be challenges in getting these clauses inserted where the risk profile shifts. We often see that the employer doesn't want to take on the responsibility of a risk if it can't manage it. But as I've said, with regards to price escalation, it is a joint matter, and it's something which has to be dealt with by both the contractor, the employer, and indeed, dare I say, the subcontractors as well. Employers and contractors, they should be working together to educate each other on how the unstable economy will have an impact on material shortages and the labour. And if they don't work together, then this will cause significant problems on projects in terms of getting them over the line and getting completed, and indeed enabling the contractor to get paid for the work that's been undertaken. One way to make escalation palatable is to have the contractor absorb the price increase up to a certain percentage, and then the employer may well pay for an increase above the agreed percentage. So here in the UK, I was advising on a contract a couple of years ago, and it was an NEC contract, and the employer wasn't going to entertain a price escalation clause. We eventually got them to agree to it, and we put it into the risk pot of the NEC, whereby the contractor agreed to absorb the price increase up to and above 6%, sorry, up to 6%. And then the employer would then absorb the price increase of anything over 6%. So that was a way that we convinced the employer that, you know, without having this risk within the contract, there was no way that the contractor was going to sign those terms and conditions. And indeed, the employer wasn't going to get their project completed. And as I say, we eventually convinced the employer to agree to amending the risk pot and taking that joint collaborative approach to dealing with the risk profile. The employer and the contractor, they could split the percentages equally in terms of price escalation. Or you could have a maximum percentage increase that the employer will pay, so that the employer knows there is a limit to the price increase. So those are some ways there of how you might wish to negotiate such clauses within your contracts. And as I say, from that poll, it suggests that you've been able to agree and negotiate your price escalation clauses. Whether they've been administered correctly or indeed palatably is another matter, but hopefully there may be some questions on that we could answer. So what else can be done? Well, in the past, we had the force majeure clauses, predominantly within the FIDIC, but this seemed to be the only option. However, these clauses generally provide only additional time for the contractors. This on its own is an impractical solution for the problems faced by contractors and employers, with continuing impact of price escalation in 2022. So the force majeure clauses themselves do not address cost escalation. Contractors and employers may need to therefore negotiate themselves a separate price escalation clause. And to be effective, a price escalation should set the baseline price, the bid price of the contract, and the ceiling price and the floor price. Any clause should be based on objective index such as the consumer or producer price index, which the parties agree to at the start of the contract. So it's really important that you get this set down within your contract provisions somewhere in terms of what price index you are referencing to. And as I say, with regards to the baseline price, understand what that is, get that formulated, and then obviously work with that and get that specified within the contract in terms of what you think the ceiling price and the floor price might be. So as I said, price escalation clauses are common in international contracts. The FIDIC Red Book 99 provides for adjustments for changes in costs, and this is dealt with at subclause 13.8. And contractors that are suffering economic volatility should review their contracts to determine whether a price escalation clause is present or not. Parties should also consider whether a price escalation clause can be avoided, i.e. by selecting alternative products where previously specified materials are not available and can't be procured. What is the best way to use an escalation clause? Well, as always, the contractor should give notice where there is a substantial price increase, because you are looking to get a variation, get an additional cost paid for. So if the contract, you must give a notice. Then as in anything else with regards to extensions of time, variations, claims, then you must give your notice and understand what the contract says around that. Evidence of the price increase should be given. It should be substantiated with the dates and prices between the original quote and the current quote. This is really important. This goes back to, you may have heard us say this before in the ICCP, the four corners of the claim, the C's, cause, effect, entitlement, and substantiation. So you really do need to evidence and substantiate the price that you originally had in the contract, the dates when you came to procure that material or that labour or that piece of equipment, and the price escalation between the two. And you need to be able to evidence that quite clearly. The contractor should prepare the change order for the price increase using the formula in the escalation clause. And as I've said, Christian's going to talk shortly around the application of the formula methodology and the escalation clauses. And in preparing your change order, this will assist the employer to make an informed decision as to whether to procure the materials, or the employer may wish to substitute materials with a lower specification or cost. So if a specific piece of material is too high in price, then the employer may well wish to substitute an alternative. And again, giving that notice, working through the contract, evidencing it in terms of the price escalation will allow the employer to make those informed decisions. And again, it comes back to both the contractor and the employer working harmoniously around the best interest of the project. And ultimately, the employer should sign off to the changes. So those changes may well be, yes, there's a price acceptance and it's a cost of X, Y, or the employer will give you an instruction to substitute, as I've said, the materials in the first instance. What other considerations are there when considering clauses? Well, be ready for the employer to require you to order materials in advance to keep prices, to keep the current price. So that may well require you to forward order. In doing that, you might need to be thinking about where you're going to stock this material. Have you got a warehouse, or have you got a laydown area, particularly on the project where these materials can be stored if you're going to pre-order them and pre-purchase them? That then needs to be borne in mind in terms of the cost increases for putting that laydown area down, taking that additional facility on board for storing the materials. So there's a quid pro quo there in terms of, if the employer does ask you to pre-order and pre-procure, then whose responsibility is that as well in terms of the materials for insurance and indeed the costs associated with that. The employers will want to see the contractors are diligent in staying ahead of the market and also trying to protect the employer from exorbitant price increases. So this is a key area where, again, you need to have this collaborative approach. Inflation clauses may only be applicable for certain elements in materials. So this is something to bear in mind. As I've said, we've seen particular price increases on steel in particular, and also plaster and plasterboard. That's gone up tremendously here, but other elements haven't gone up. So applying the price escalation across all of your contract sum wouldn't necessarily be the correct method and the correct approach. So it's specifically identifying aspects of your contract where the price of the material or the price of the product has increased. That's the key thing to establish here. We want to get to what's called an annual escalation rate, which is the current cost or value minus the initial price or value divided by the initial price in a 1-year period. So this is what we're trying to get to in terms of understanding an annual escalation on your particular project. So in terms of seeking contractual relief for price escalation, well, as I've said, employers will require and desire price certainty and will invariably push back against negotiating price escalation clauses. So again, referencing my example before, where the employer was kicking back on the acceptance of a price escalation clause, we advised our client that we thought it would be foolhardy for them to accept that contract without the price escalation going in. And indeed, the contractor pushed back. And in that particular example, as I say, the employer eventually decided to come around the table and negotiate that price escalation within the risk pot of that particular contract. One strategy may be to include a commensurate savings provision that accounts for any decrease in pricing for materials to the employer's benefit. So we've seen that happen before. But this option does require cost transparency. And as with all these things, it will add another administrative burden to a construction project that might already be under pressure with regards to maintaining those records, carrying out valuations of work, issuing notifications, making sure the claim information is there. As I say, this is just one other administrative burden which the project might need to consider doing. On the upside of doing this is it offers an equitable measure of protection for both parties, particularly where you've got that cost transparency playing out. Another option may well be the delay provision. This could provide an equitable adjustment for material cost increases realised from project delays linked to material issues. One needs to be mindful of no damages for delay provisions, which can legally undermine a request for an equitable adjustment for price increases due to project delays. Many jurisdictions have common law exceptions to no damage for delay provisions, so be mindful of this. And contracts containing timers of the essence provisions are another potential delay-related avenue for relief from significant material price increases. But the challenge does remain for all estimating teams on construction projects, having to try and find creative ways to account for material escalation while remaining competitive in this incredibly challenging environment that we're working in. So I'm going to hand over now to Christiaan. I've just given you some of my thoughts on how you might wish to deal with price escalation and how you should deal with them on projects. I'm going to hand over to Christiaan now, and Christiaan, you want me to control the slides here, so just let me know when you want me to move on. Thank you, Christiaan.
Sure, 100%. Paul, thank you very much for that introduction. All right, let's have a look at the way how mainly FIDIC and many of these cost escalation formulas and cost escalation principle operate. You guys basically have got two potential ways how you do it in generally. You've got rise and fall, where you've got a remuneration based on actual cost variation. So what does that mean? For example, let's say you've got a very fluctuating item. The contract can read that you base your cost on a certain base cost, and then you are remunerated depending on your actual invoice. What is, for instance, a very good example there is I'm working on a project in Ethiopia right now where cement and diesel fuel, diesel and petrol, are actually imported items. So those items are very dependent on the FX rates, etc. So they can vary quite a lot. So as part of your original contract, the price for those items were fixed as base date, and then the actual costs are adjusted according to the invoice. I've had that also. I grew up work-wise in South Africa, where we had a lot of problems with asphalt price variations, and as well as all petrochemical issues. And that was where rise and fall came into play quite extensively. Next slide, please. Then the next one is the formula, which are generally in the FIDIC 1999 Red Book and Yellow Book. Now, what is interesting is, and this you need to take notice of, the Silver Book does not have this formula in that, and the new 2017 doesn't have this formula in. Not to say that that you can't use them, but 2017 just said, we are not going to give you a default position, but they also have got this formula as you've got that as an example that you can use. So it's just not a default position, but it's available. So those of you who knows the formula, it is something which you can do that you show on the screen there. And this you can add on many numerators as you've gone. Okay, next slide. So the PN is the adjustment that you have on a monthly invoice. Your IPC is automatically adjusted. If this formula is in your contract, you don't need to do a notice to have this applied. It is already automated. So you start off with a number A there, next slide, which is a percentage which is considered is not escalated or is not adjusted. It's not going to adjust through the period of your contract. So next slide. And then you've got a breakdown, your B, C, D. Now what I've got there is, let's say you've got labor, environment, equipment, and materials. Now you can have fuel, you can have as many as you want to have. But those factors, A, B, C, and D, E, F, G, H, whatever it is, that all has to sum up to a unit. So A, B, C, D, etc. will equal to 1. And this is the first thing that it also has to work out. So your adjustment eventually look at how much do you adjust your monthly invoice. Next slide. Then you've got your base indices. Now, usually you use your statistical indices, and there, as part of your contract, you will select, or there will be a prescribed statistical index to control these items. And then you review that against how you go through the different months. Next slide. And you will have your N values, which are for the specific month. So next slide. You will then end up having the calculation of those different items. Now, as part of your tender, you will either be prescribed what are your base values and indices, the percentages, the A, which is in this case 10%, which they say 10% of the values will not change, and then B, C, D, E, F, whatever it is, how much that build up. The country or region of the country index is just basically how you get your reference to your base index. Now, if it is a domestic contract, you will use domestic indices. If it's an international contract, you may use international indices. And you can have variations where you have got a local part of your contract paid, and part of your contract is paid in an international currency or different currencies. And so you can have different formulas for the different currencies. So how are you going to apply this? Now let's go through quickly through an example. So next slide, please, Paul. So you start off with having your formula, and the next step is, next one, Chris, Paul. You have to have, if you look at that first one, your 20 plus 15 plus 14 plus 25 equals 100%. So that is important. That always has to be the baseline. And if you look at the second line, the 1, 2, 3, 4 as the LO, and the 2.154 and the 16.098 for MO. These are just examples that I took, and that will be the case during the tender stage or your base stage, which are usually around about a month before the closing of the tender, because that is what you use your pricing schedule then. Then in that month PN, which we've got on the third line, you then go back to those same indices and you check what is the current index of those specific indices, and you do the calculation. Next slide, please. And in this case, you will see that your labor, you get a 0.7, you get a 0.7% increase in your labor allowable. You get a 4% in this example of your equipment, and you get a negative on your material, which is possible depending on how things are developed. So in this case, if you then finalize your IPC for the month, you get that sum, and on the next line, I think we've got the actual adjustment. Yes, so in this example, for this month, for this IPC, you will get a 1.6% additional payment for your value of work performed during the month. So it is a simple way of applying it. Yes, it can have problems because you've got to make sure that your alternatives are correct. But it helps because it is an agreed method to apply something that will happen in the future. Will it always work? No. Will it sometimes be inaccurate? It all depends on the indices that you choose, and that is very important, to choose the correct indice, or which you consider is the most appropriate indice for that. And I think that is the slide. What is the next slide we've got there?
Next question. Yeah.
Yeah. So that wraps up the way how the FIDIC or the general escalation clauses work. Now, if you've got rise and fall, you've got exactly the same situation. It's a similar situation, but it is a limited area on where we have it. So in FIDIC, we are fortunate that they have got that, but I've seen this clause in many other contracts that I work with. Does it give you 100% accurate adjustment? No, definitely not. But it gives you a best estimate of the situation, and it gives you a balanced outlook, as long as your indices have been chosen correctly. So that, in short, is the application of a FIDIC formula or a formula that you can use. But just to sum up, Red Book and Yellow Book has got the 1999 Red Book and Yellow Book has got this as default, but it can be written out. The Silver Book does not have it as a default, but it can be written in. 2017 does not have that in as a default, but it can be written in. And that is just quickly on how you apply it. So I think let's wrap up the presentation part and let's move on to the questions.
Thanks, Christiaan. As Christiaan says, it's the use of the formula. It is common practice. It's not, always accepted, but at least it's a starting point. At least it gets the dialogue going on those various construction projects out there. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and then I think we'll open it up to the panel for any Q&A.
So let's start off with Shuhadin Muhammad's question, which is, if it's a lump sum contract, even though the price escalation clause work out. Now, my understanding is that your question is, if it is a lump sum contract, what about escalation? Now, if you have got, let's say, a yellow book or a silver book, which is lump sum, and you have got an escalation clause in there, that escalation clause is applied. The lump sum is basically says it's not a remeasured project. So you will have that, but the cost on every month is adjusted accordingly. I've got a project the Ethiopian project also has got a silver book, a 1999 silver book, which is a lump sum, but with an escalation clause written in. For that contract, which is now 3.5 years running, the local portion of the escalation is adjusted by about 3.3 times every month. So that gives you an idea of just how extensive escalations can be. Drasan Babik, both FIDIC red and yellow 1999 suits provide clause 13.8. Can you please comment any difference in approach when preparing the price escalation formula from the unit price lump sum point? That's basically what I mentioned just now. The lump sum is still fixed, but the payment for every month is adjusted accordingly. So it's basically the same question as we had on the previous one.
Okay. And then Amar Majid has asked the question, what are my thoughts on the use of vesting certificates to secure large quantities of materials in advance? Vesting certificates are good, but what you need to do is ensure that you've accounted for them properly, that they record that the materials, where they are, you need to reference, and I would suggest taking photographic evidence. You need to ensure that you have got adequate insurance on site. And as I've said before, with regards to those materials that are off-site, that are being vested, then you need to make sure that they are properly secured and that the employer or the supplier of those materials aren't then using them elsewhere, and that you've then got them on a call-off at some future date. So I've used vesting certificates in the past. They do work particularly well, so long as they are administered correctly. If they're not administered correctly, then there's a whole host of issues that can go wrong there. The next one, I'll pick up this one. It's Oluwol Adeltola. Forgive me if I've mentioned that incorrectly. But it says, if contractors are allowed to absorb price escalation or a percentage, let's say 6% in their tender, what happens if this escalation did not materialise? Will the contractor not be paid? Well, if you've allocated it within your contract sum and your contract is agreed, inclusive of that 6%, if you don't incur that 6%, then it's part of the contract sum, it's part of the original contract. I think if you have it, as I said, within this risk pot that we had, whereby we identified the 6% as a risk profile, if that 6% wasn't achieved or wasn't incurred, then the contractor wouldn't have been paid that 6% increase. So it depends on where you've allocated it. If it's within the overall price, the overall contract sum, it's lost and it's therefore part of the contract sum as far as I can see it. But if you've ring-fenced it and separated it out and got it in a risk pot, like the example I gave, if that 6% isn't achieved or isn't materialized, then the contractor won't be entitled to be paid for the 6%.
Paul, if I can come in on that one, a lot depends on how you write, how it is structured. If it is the case, if it's written that the contractor will take the risk of the first 6%, then the chances are very good that he would have priced that into his price. If the risk is then, if the actual then is 1%, good for him. Then he has got that. If it is a risk that has, if it is an amount that needs to be calculated and shown, and say that the contractor will be remunerated up to a maximum of 6%, then he will only get what is the actual. So that really depends on the actual wording of the clause and how it's been written.
Yeah, it goes back to the provisions of the contract and again, knowing what the contract clauses say. There's one here from Leah Ganda, which is regarding FIDIC clause 13.7. So
I
can
go with that one. The clause is, the question is, Paul has mentioned that the contractor should prepare a change order for the employer's approval. However, subclause 13.8 actually only requires the contractor to include the adjusted amounts in accordance with the schedule, which shall then be certified in the IPC. Please clarify. Yes, the way how clause 13.8 is written and how the I can't remember now, the IPC needs to be structured, you do not need to do a change order. That is an automatic entitlement as part of your IPC. So there's no need for an additional notice and or price adjustment that comes in or automatically as part of the contract.
Okay, and then Lili NG has reference about the materials, procure materials ahead of time to be stored in an appropriate warehouse or laid down. What if the intended materials is not kept on site or approved laid down areas, i.e. kept at vendors' warehouses? This goes back to that vesting certificate, that the vesting issues that was referenced earlier, and the difficulties you may well have if you haven't vested those materials and identified them separately and kept them separate for your future use. Okay. How would you handle a situation where the contract does not provide for a price adjustment escalation clause, and a situation where the procurement for the works took place in 2019 before the war came to a standstill, but the contract was signed and became effective in 2021, and everything is crazily high? It eventually became impossible for the contractor to execute the contract at the prices bidded for 2019. Well, I think if your contract hasn't got a price escalation clause, then you're in a bit of difficulty, I would suggest. I think it's what you've got to try and do is convince the employer that when you bid the project in 2019 to when you're actually undertaking the work in 2021 and when the contract became engrossed, you may wish to try and get the sympathetic ear of the employer. As I say, without having that price escalation clause in, you're going to make it particularly difficult. You may well think that there might be a claim in there somewhere. And as I've said, you may wish to look at the force majeure part of that. But that, again, will not give you full entitlement. So, again, you've got to look at it on its own merits in terms of evidencing and demonstrating and substantiating what actually happened. And, as I say, trying to negotiate as best you can with the employer in that instance.
Yeah, also to follow up on that, the way that you've written it there is that your base price is 2019, so COVID came in 2020. Now, there's a few ways how you can look at that. First of all is have a look at, I was talking specifically from the FIDIC point of view, look at the guidelines that FIDIC has presented. Now, one of the more appropriate ways to claim costs due to COVID is maybe due to change in law. First of all, you can say, if you can't do change in law, you can say that, is this a condition that you could have reasonably foreseen? And you can use 20.1 as additional amounts at something that was just not foreseeable. When you did the tender does not allow or does not prescribe the scope of risk, the risk scope in a situation like that. So first step is to try and negotiate an agreement with the contractor and with the employer. Would have been ideal if you did that during the award stage, but if it's not there, I trust that you gave a notice at least for changes in legislation or at least for other reasons to keep your claim alive. But yes, in 2019, you didn't know about that, so it was not reasonable to price for it. So now you need to look at, is there a contractual entitlement that you can use? First of all, change in law is one of the better ones that you can use. And also look at the conditions of the legal part, the Contract Act of the country, if you can use that to build an entitlement.
Francis Adetola, regards to fuel, is fuel not consumables and not a measured element or cost headings in a tender? If so, how do you calculate the volume used for a particular project for the purposes of fluctuation calculation? Any thoughts on that, Christiaan?
What we've done in Rise and Fall, you will provide a price cost for your fuel per liter of fuel, and you will issue invoices of actual fuel bought. And the difference in the price, the base price and the actual paid price would be as a remuneration, would come in as a straight line remuneration for the contractor. In a case like that, yes, it would be good if there is some protection built into that the guy doesn't have his own fuel depot next to the construction site and he buys it through the contract to sell it on the sideline. But I mean, as those are the type of things that you just need to check. But the risk of rise and fall, the risk of the item lies then with the employer, and he pays for that. It's similar with cement. Who pays for the wastage? That is something of how it needs to be written into the contract, is how this is calculated. You can write in a potential volume used per cubic meters or per lineal meters or whatever, depending on what your contract is. But you have to be careful that you don't make it so complicated that you lose the plot. There are relatively good guidelines on fuel consumptions for certain productions. So if you're on the engineer or the employer side, you can check if your fuel consumptions is within reason. Number one, if it is not in the, if the fuel consumptions or an estimate of the fuel consumptions was not built into the initial tender. But you can look at what is reasonable amounts to be considered in the consumption of fuel, as per your example there.
And I think just going back to that, the substantiation of the volumes that you are incurring is absolutely key. So it's evidencing that, as Christiaan said. Can you please provide cost examples that fall under a factor within the FIDIC escalation formula?
Depends also on what is what in the region where you are. Is it international? Is it not? Is it, or is it domestic? Good question is, how stable is your salaries for labor? If your salaries for labor tends to stick as a fixed amount, that is something that will go in there. It is usually rather a thumbs up to say X% of your costs are not escalatable or will not be influenced. I know that, for instance, in Pakistan, the domestic contracts use factor A as a 60%, which I believe is grossly overrated. But if you go to a 1 or 2%, that's underrated. The contracts that I've been working with varied between 10 to 20%. And remember, your formula is just an estimate. So it doesn't need to be a fixed amount. It is just what you consider as reasonable. You will also know from your own costing what tends to be fairly constant from one year to another year.
So this is a good one. So the contractor set up the wrong base indices in the bid, which was eventually accepted by the employer. So 2 years down the road, it was discovered. So the question is, who is at fault for this? And does the correct index apply to all previously overpaid IPCs? Well, my view would be that the contractor is at fault for getting the indices incorrect. And obviously the contractor will be stuck with that indices moving forward. Christiaan, do you have an opposing view on that?
What you do have there in FIDIC, you have got, I'm just going to open the right thing here. All right. In FIDIC, you do have some leeway how to address this. As part of your clause 13.8, it says the cost indices or reference prices stated in the table of adjustment data shall be used. Okay, so all fine. If the source is in doubt, it shall be determined by the engineer. For this purpose, reference shall be made to the values of the indices at stated date. So you need to have a look at that. You enter into a negotiation there to try and find out what is the situation. It is not something that is specifically addressed in the general conditions of contract, and largely depends on the situation at the time. It is maybe an index that was written in as part of the tender. It may be an index that has been discontinued. So one has to look at the actual situation in that time. It's not who's at fault, but how can we fix the problem?
From where do we obtain the LO, EO, and MO from for the formulas?
I can give that now. Also, just from my side, I've got time. So if people want to stay on and have more questions, I don't mind. I can go on longer if people have to jump off. Your LO figures are usually statistical values. It is described in the contract. A lot depends on the country, but often the government has certain statistical values and data which they publish, and that are usually what you're using. You just need to identify which one of the statistical indices you have to use for what specific area.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Christiaan. Jen, that brings us up to the hour slot. How quickly an hour goes.
Indeed, yes. Yeah, and we still got 17 questions, plus I know a separate one that I gave to Christiaan yesterday. I know that your diary is always jam-packed from morning to night, so if you need to go, I will thank you very much for your time and your input, and I will also gratefully accept Christiaan's offer to sit on a bit longer and see if we can get through these questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been enjoyable, and hopefully you've taken some advice today from this webinar. I look forward to seeing you again on another webinar for the ICCP. And thank you, Jen, and thank you, Christiaan, for being part of this today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Hassan Ghaffar, you said, what if the contract does not have price escalation clause? Should the contractor use the normal claims clause to claim its losses due to escalation? How likely is this claim to succeed? It is, again, what is written in the contract. Who took the risk? At the end of the day, let's say you have got, just for example, a contract that is supposed to run for example, 3 years. You've got a fixed price with no escalation, or you've got fixed rates with no escalation. Then usually it would be considered that you allowed for that escalation, potential escalation over the 3 years. If the prices rise more than that you could have expected, you took that risk. And you have to come up with some really fancy footwork to show that it was unreasonable to expect, or that the increases were much higher than what would have been reasonably expected. Then you can try for a claim, but generally you will have a battle on your hand. On the flip side of the coin, let's say the same situation, and this is one of the questions that came in before the meeting. Let's say you've got a 3-year contract, and now you've got an extension of time. Now you can say, hold on, guys, I took the risk for the 3 years, not for past of the 3 years. Now you've got either, if it's a variation, you can include that in the variation negotiations, or if it's an extension of time, that then becomes a cost due to the extension of time, due to the overrun. Yes, Mr. Employer, I expected, as the contractor, I expected to have a certain amount of escalation, and I took the risk for the escalation for the 3 years, but now due to whatever reasons where you took the risk, I've got an extension of time for, let's say, another year. The escalation on that year, that becomes a potential entitlement under a cost adjustment under 20.1. Then, Walid, for the fixed cost contracts, how can we estimate the price escalation if it is still escalating? You're the tenderer. You've got to decide that it's your risk. You decide what it is. What is interesting is that, for instance, in silver book contracts, where it's just a lump sum, it's not uncommon to find contractors raising their prices to by about 20% depending on the duration, to accept the quantity and the escalation risk. So that is often a case of you need to decide what is the risk that you're prepared to take, which is not really beneficial, because then usually what happens is the person with the greatest affinity to risk is the person with the lowest tender, which may get the contract, and then if the escalation runs against him, you end up having a big fight on your hands. All right, Engineer Ghulam, can we make a change to a fixed component of adjustment formula during the execution of the project? My question is, can you change your contract? If you can change your contract, this is a change in the contract. That is a variation to the contract. How will you come and negotiate that variation? How are you going to substantiate that you could, well, first of all, you made a mistake, or whatever the amount was a mistake. Remember, contracts and the execution of contracts, the contract's executioner, the engineer or the administrator, does not need to be reasonable. He needs to be contractual. Now, if you entered into that contract with a wrong fixed component, you entered into that contract, you took the risk. Why do you want to change it now? What are you going to bring to the table for the other party to prepare to review it? This is why it's so important to actually know what is in your contract before you sign on the dotted line. Raymond, your question, when the indices in the contract or inflation clauses is unable to cater for the inflation because of hyper price escalation, what options do you have under the contract? Well, if your indices were chosen correctly, it should act accordingly to the hyperinflation. If your indices were wrong, then you may have a problem. However, that is again the index that you agreed to originally. So you end up being on the same situation is you want to try and change the contract because of an error. Now, who made that error? Was it prescribed? It might have been prescribed, but it's still something which the contractor accepted. If there is something which is so radical that the indices will not pick it up, or if the indices is changing, or if the scope of the work is changing, again, you enter into a negotiation situation, which is usually best to try and negotiate a settlement, but with the understanding is that you've got a contract, you've got to comply with the contract. Nirusham Pramuka, how do we calculate the escalation where indices are not available, for instance, in Gulf region countries haven't? What you find in many of the Gulf region countries is you tender for a fixed rates, either fixed price or fixed rates. So the contractor has to allow for escalation of prices within his rates. And then that is, you can look at historic increase in prices, which you can use. But the contractor in that case take the risk of escalation, a price for it, and to get any adjustment to that, you'll need to come up with some fancy footwork. If you've got an extension of time, that is one possibility that you can consider. If there's a major change, for instance, the Ukraine-Russian war, where prices has absolutely skyrocketed, that is something you could not have reasonably foreseen. If your contract does not allow for cost increases, for instance, like COVID, you can use that as an example. What is interesting is that the Saudi High Court actually gave the courts the entitlement to rewrite contracts to adjust prices due to COVID costs. So those are the type of things that you can consider. Ghulam Dastagir, so adjustment formula can serve current inflation fully. It is an estimate. Remember, this is not a cost plus contract. It is a best estimate at the time of tender, which is a reasonable application of the risk. Is it going to be 100%? No, definitely not. Because, except if you have got such amount of detailed and many indices, then you've got a reasonable chance. But I mean, it's even the distribution of the different parts change from month to month. So that is the balanced best estimate of the overall influence that you have got on that one. Mohammed Daoud, you said, thank you so much for the webinar. Still, I have doubt. Since I'm dealing with contracts with no escalation provision or equation as a contractor, I'm entitled to price escalation claim in such case as COVID circumstances. The price escalation clause is there to distribute risk, to help the risk formula. That doesn't say you cannot claim if there is no escalation formula, for instance, for COVID. Now, if you use FIDIC, again, as I said, you may consider items like a change in law clause. You may consider, depending on the country where you are, the ruling of the Saudi courts, which says they can rewrite the contract because of COVID costs. And it depends on how the contract is written. If the contract is written that the contractor takes the risk of escalation, then you take the risk and it is deemed that you priced for that risk. So you take the risk, you price for the risk. If your tender is out and you want now more money, remember maybe the guy that had the right estimate for the escalation is the guy that was second for the price and didn't get the project. But for COVID, it is different. That is something, depending on when you submitted the tender, was it reasonable to foresee? And again, who takes the risk? After effecting price adjustment, how to address the foreign currency fluctuations? Any correction factor for foreign currency? That again depends on your contract. Usually, if you've got a contract which allows for different currencies, then it will be addressed how you address it. But now let's say you've got a single price currency, then nothing stops you from writing in a factor for foreign currency adjustments in your price adjustment. Again, when you look at the tender, who took the risk of that foreign currency fluctuation and how was it addressed in the tender? It's not something that you can come up and add towards the end. Now, you can say that, all right, but let's say, for instance, we take European rates, which were fairly constant over the last few years. And now with the Ukraine war, it has got a rapid increase. Now you are entering into either a force majeure, depending on where you are, or in a clause 20.1 claim for additional payment. Sierra Leone, all right, what is the percentage of inflation that will trigger price variation? If it is written in your contract, like the FIDIC 13.8, there's no trigger. It is written in, if it is 1% up or down, you get that 1% up or down for every, for your IPC. There's not a specific trigger. Your contract may say that there's a specific trigger, but that will then be separately written into that. What happens when the employer refuses to pay price increases under FIDIC Silver 1999? First question is, was price increases written into your contract? Because the default FIDIC Silver 1991 does not have it in. So that should become as a particular conditions of contract. However, let's say it is in the particular contract conditions of contract, the employer still refuses to pay price increases, is in breach of contract. And this is the same thing as in any other situation, is in breach of contract. If he refuses to pay your IPC, you've got clause 16.1 where you can terminate or suspend part of the works. If it is not certified by the employer's representative, you can also use to say, I think it's 14.3 said that your IPC is not reasonable, and therefore you can still use clause 16.1 to either terminate or suspend. So those are the items, or then finally you can use either the DB or arbitration in that case. Let's say the contractor is a lump sum contract and the price adjustment clause has been deleted using particular conditions of contract. However, the contractor has mentioned applicable price escalation in work order after price validity of 46 months. All right, the way that I read your question is that price escalation will not apply for the first 46 months, but then it will kick in. Now, if I read your question right, this is then the situation. Now, it just all depends on how it was written and at what level is this works order. Yeah, you need to look that in detail. That is something which I cannot answer you off the cuff. We need to look at the specifics of that.
I will just jump in and say, if this anonymous attendee is a member and you wish to remain anonymous, please, by all means, email me this question and I will put it in the LinkedIn group, maintaining your anonymity. And then if there are more details, then you can get a better answer.
Sure. Or if you want, if you want to contact me directly, then we can look at it in more detail. So, Wimlaratine Gamlath, what will happen if the price indices are not reflecting the actual market price? Then you either choose the wrong index or the statistical bureau of the country is pulling the wool over people's eyes, but the index is supposed to be dependable, but it really depends on if you choose the right index. Now, for you to go and show that the price index, if chosen correctly, are not reflecting the actual market price, is going to be an uphill battle. If you make that claim, you've got the burden to prove that. Now, how you're going to do that, that is going to be the real challenge. Uditya Dasham Mahesh Fernando, once pre-purchased material are stored in case of expiry of material, how do we cover under FIDIC, under insurance, or what? If your material is expired, it's non-compliant. You cannot use non-compliant material. As simple as that. Now, if it has expired because of an extension of time that was awarded, who was at fault that you got the extension of time? So that is the way how you need to look at that one. Wimalarathin Gamlath, if there's no price adjustment clause, can the contractors ask for new rates for the remaining works after the regional period of contract when EOT is granted for the employer's delay? Absolutely. this is now where it comes in. You're in a claim situation. You took the risk for price increases for the original time period. If you now got an extension of time because of, as you say, employer's delay, that is a 2.1, well, employer's delay depends on what is the delay, but that is the employer's risk. It is a cost that you incur due to the employer's risk event. Therefore, that is a claimable item. Ronald Tisingwire, can the equitable principle of unjust benefit apply when the contract does not provide for a price adjustment clause? The employer got a benefit, he should not just take it minus payment. This you need to look at the law of the country. Now, most of the contractor law says that we apply the contract that you agreed to. So if you agree to no escalation, the employer can say, yeah, but you priced in for that. So it's not that he is unjustly benefited. It is a price that you proposed as the contractor, and therefore the employer accepted that price, and therefore it is not unjust benefit. He's paying the price that you asked for. If there's other reasons, for instance, an extension of time or things like that, that plays a different role. Mohammed, what are the base index references used in the Middle East? Examples, please. I don't have the Middle East statistics with me, but there could be statistics published by the different companies, different countries. It may also be if the source is from abroad, that you use indices from abroad. You need to go and look at the statistic at the Department of the Statistics of the country where your cost generates from, and you've got to look at those ones. Some of these countries has got hundreds of different indices, so you need to be quite careful in the selection of the specific one. All right, Robin, let's read your question. Under FIDIC MDB version of the contract, if the contract doesn't allow price adjustment during the original contract duration, will the contract be entitled to claim price adjustment during an extended period if EOT was granted for the employer delay event? What will be the base date for the calculations of price adjustment during the extended period? Can increase in material and labor price be part of the prolongation claim? Will DB consider decisions in contract's favor in such a case? The easy answer is yes. This is an extension of time. Let's look at the risk. The contractor offered a price to perform work. No, the contractor offered a price to perform work within a certain period. Now, if for any reason the contractor is delayed due to something which is the employer's risk, which seems to be the case here, then the employer has caused the contractor to experience higher costs. So therefore, it is his risk. Remember, a claim is there to put the contractor back into a position where he should have been, or he would have been if it wasn't for the problem. So in this case is, Mr. Employer, I've got to do this work for a later period. I have got costs in excess of what I would have had. And therefore, the easy answer is yes, he is entitled to it. But remember, whenever there's a claim, the claimant has got the burden of proof. So although it may be easy to show the entitlement or the principal, it is still the contractor's duty to show the quantum. So he needs to come up to say, during my tender, this is what I have reasonably foreseen. This is the cost now. Now you can look at different alternatives. Was this cost going to be early in the project? Or was it going to be towards the end of the project? Or is it going to be varying through the period of the contract? And based on those are the type of items where the contractor then needs to make a compelling case to either the engineer or, in this case, in the DB. But it's clear. It is a problem caused by what you described. It's a problem caused by the employer. It is his risk. He has to pay for it. A proper DB will have to consider that in favor of the contractor, the principal, and depending on how the contractor presents it, he also has got a quantum entitlement. All right, Gregory Omito. As a follow-up that there is room to claim after the initial fixed period expose, can the employer, as a defense to additional calculation costs in a fixed price rates contract, use concurrent delay as a defense? Yes, the contractor can use it. The employer can use it. The question is as who brings the best presentation to the table. What a DB will look at is why this where is the original delay? What is the original delay? Was that an employer's risk? What would have happened if that employer's risk was not there? Would the contractor then still have a delay? Or could he do the work within the period? So it is, again, it's one of those, the specific situation will rule it. But in a general answer, yes, the employer can use that or can try to use that as a defense. It all depends on the specifics of the specific situation.
All right, thank you. I think the only thing I want to ask is, did you touch on the questions that were submitted by email?
I'm just going to have a quick look through them. Question number 1 has been answered. That is, with no price adjustment clause and the contractor period has been extended due to employer's delay, can the contractor ask for new rates? That one we got. Question 2, price with price adjustment clause and contract period has been extended due to employer's delay. Contractor is claiming that the price indices published by the government are not reflecting the actual market price. Again, my answer, we've answered that one. The burden of proof lies within the party that alleges. So you'll have to come up with some fancy footwork to show that either the index was wrong or that the Department of Statistics are making mistakes, which is not going to be easy. Question that we didn't answer, FIDIC clause 4.2 says that the contractor has to submit the performance bond at his cost. That means costs incurred in obtaining the performance bonds should not be part of the accepted contract amount. Is that correct? No, it's not correct. Your accepted contract amount is the full amount. If you look at 411, it says that the sufficiency of the accepted contract amount, although the although there may not be a specific bill of quantity item to pay the performance bond, it's still a cost. And if you look at cost, the cost is, that is part of the cost, capital C. And the contractor should have allowed that somewhere in his tender. If there's not a specific item, it may be a markup or as part of a markup, but no, it forms part of the accepted contract amount. You cannot add that as another item in the accepted contract amount. Then for subclause 8.4 allows contractor to claim EOT for variations. How about the corresponding prolongation costs? Contractor rates include a percentage for overhead, but it's not sufficient. Now, if you look for variation, one usually needs to also address extension of time in the variation. However, if your variation rates is inadequate, then your original rates were inadequate. Now, if your original rates were inadequate, how can you now ask for new rates if it is similar situation with a different price structure? So you will have quite a battle on your hands to claim for additional prolongation cost because of a variation which has been agreed and paid, and EOT was given for that. If it is just an EOT, you've got to come up with the reasons why your variation price, which is agreed, does not cover your prolongation cost if there is a prolongation cost claim in. But then on the other hand is, if your variation does not include that, and you get an additional extension of time because of that, you can push to try and get under entitlement 20.1. 8.4 doesn't give you an entitlement for prolongation cost. All right, I think that wraps up everything.
All right. Wow, well, this was a marathon. I feel like you've had a bit of a test of your knowledge of price escalation with the rapid fire questions. You answered over 30 questions. So,
all right.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. What I would like to share with the guys, just in summary, your escalation clause is not a cure-all, but it's definitely a way to reduce potential disagreements and disputes. It is not always going to work. It's not always going to address everything, but it is going quite a long way to prevent problems. There will definitely be cases where it doesn't work, and for those items, you need to look carefully at your actual contract and see, do you have a contract entitlement, or from the engineer's point of view or the employer's point of view, does the contractor have an entitlement, and is it contractually defendable to review it? Now, at the end of the day, reasonableness also comes into play. Was it reasonable for the contractor to expect such a cost? If not, let's play fair and we look at the whole process and we try and find a solution. But, you know, many of these questions are a little bit shooting from the hip. So if there are specific situations, you're more than welcome to contact me for more detailed review of specific items. Good.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I will also once again say that if any members have questions, we do have the private LinkedIn group You may post your questions yourself. If you wish to maintain anonymity, you can send them to me and I will post on your behalf. And of course, a little plug for our template library. Some time ago, due to, again, a member request, Christiaan very generously put together a clause 13.8 template. So if that is something that you are interested in, it is in the template library. All right. And yeah, thank you. We've got still 76 people in attendance. So thank you very much. Right, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. And I think that'll just about wrap us up. All right, thanks, Christiaan.
Pleasure, and everyone have a good day, and may everything go well for you.